Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Ryan Mitchel Brown is a nutritional therapist and an autoimmune survivor who ended up spending over $20,000 of his hard earned money trying to improve his own chronic health conditions, including a condition called TH-HDS Small Fiber Neuropathy and Hashimoto's Thyroiditis. Eventually, Ryan quit the conventional medical model and went back to school in order to figure out the root causes of his problems. During this time of self discovery, Ryan found the power of embracing circadian principles paired with a holistic approach to chronic diseases, which involve diet modification, specifically involving the use of therapeutic metabolic therapy, targeted supplementation, and brain retraining. These unconventional treatments eventually brought a complete remission in several of Ryan Health's conditions. Ryan has currently worked with over 100 autoimmune patients from all walks of life in order to help them achieve vitality using nature's laws and sound biological principles. I found Ryan on his amazing podcast appearance on the Metabolic Mind podcast, hosted by our former guest and cardiologist, Dr. Brett Scher. You can find Ryan on his Instagram and all social media on @Ryan Mitchel Brown. Ryan Brown, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Man, thanks for having me. It's so funny hearing introductions like that. And I know it's one of those things where you kind of write them out as like the podcast guest to share with people that have you on their podcast. But it makes it seem so formal when really I'm a pretty informal person. I'm pretty laid back, generally speaking. And I was gonna say on this podcast, like I really view myself, even though I have certain qualifications and an education background and always pursuing knowledge, I really view myself as just a student of nature, and just observation. And one thing that I've really found valuable working with people one-on-one over the last 3 years is you meet so many people that seemingly come from a very similar situation. Like you mentioned, some of my autoimmune diseases that I've had to overcome over the past couple of years. But you have to approach everybody as a completely blank slate. And so, as I think we'll get to later in the podcast, that was one of the frustrations I had on my own journey as I was seeking out advice and wisdom to approach and apply to my own, situation. I kept running into these sort of protocol already typed out for you models, even within the functional space, that made it really difficult when everybody's treated with a different background. I think we'll get into some of that in a moment, probably.
Yeah, I hope so, man. It's well said. I really appreciate that input. We always tell people if they want us to read their introduction whenever they're feeling like down on themselves, just give me a buzz and I'll like read it out loud for you again, which would be quite easy for us to do because we both live in the exact same valley here in the Salt Lake Valley. I can just drive 10, 15 minutes and show up at your house and I can read your introduction for you anytime. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the importance of being out in nature and at the risk of drawing more people to the Salt Lake Valley since it's
Oh
already
yeah.
like way too busy. I mean, we both live in an area where we can get into the mountains 25, 30 minutes. You're even closer than I am. Well, I mean, what can you say about living in such an amazing place where you can actually like get out and feel like you're in the middle of nowhere in a relatively very quick amount of time?
All I can say is get to the hiking paths on odd days of the week and as early as you can. I remember we hiked Mount Olympus, which I'm sure you're aware of, just down the valley. And I got there at what I thought was a pretty early time. It was like 6:30 in the morning or something like that, and we were still parking like completely down the road to start this hike. And it's not an easy hike. I went with a couple friends, and two of them quit halfway up the mountain because it is not a beginner's hike. I think you could do it, but man, it is a steep uphill climb. That was the first time I did it, but that's the true thing is like when we talk about disease, I had an interesting conversation with a guest maybe you should have on in the future named Dr. Alexis Cowan, who's from Princeton, and we were talking about the whole concept of population density intermixed with the rates of chronic disease. And you find that in areas where the higher population densities, higher amounts of certain chronic conditions, particularly autoimmune diseases and things like that. And partially that's related to like probably hospital availability and treatment availability, which a lot of those people flock to in a conventional allopathic sense. But it also has to do with like just the living conditions. Like nature is the ultimate double-blind placebo trial that has ever been done and cannot be studied ruthlessly enough and cannot be repeated. And so one thing I always tell people that ask me if I can show them a study on XYZ to, give them some social proof. I always tell them that there's a context even within these double-blind placebo trials because they're done in a lab under artificial light, under artificial conditions. I had someone mention how, while an autoimmune disease can be a result of your environment because they've done studies where they put these people with autoimmune conditions in a sterilized room and they didn't get better. And my response to them was, well, maybe human beings aren't meant to live in a sterilized laboratory under artificial conditions. And so what I learned, and this will harken back to some of the eating disorder conversation that we're gonna have in a minute, that the way we perceive reality is only as accurate as our background development growing up. And we don't grow up in nature. We're probably the only species that's completely separated from it and views it as an alternative thing when we're really beings of this earth, like every other animal on the planet. And you have to treat your biology accordingly to that.
Yeah, I love that. I thinking about even the moment of birth, the way most of us come into this world in the most unnatural way possible, and that's how we're getting started, and it doesn't get much better from there. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I really appreciate that input. Yeah, and you mentioned the eating disorder thing, which is how I was able to find you. Learning that metabolic therapies can actually be helpful for not only weight loss for a lot of people, but also for people who need to gain weight and also, retrain their brain. I find to be absolutely totally fascinating. And so, listening to you in that episode that you did with Dr. Schur, I really wanted to reach out to you, and we'll certainly talk about other things alongside that. But I do want to start with your own personal story and how that kind of came about.
Yeah, I mean, for me, actually, I had a client ask me this earlier today in an intake call because I think with mental health in general, I mean, there's a lot of stigmas. I think in some sense, the amount of attention on it today is beneficial to people with varying diagnoses around mental health, whether it's like general anxiety or depression or even more complex things like OCD, which I have, or ADHD. But I think to some degree, it's also counterintuitive to the process of healing because what I see in society today is an obsession with labeling. And I see this exterior to the mental health community as well, with autoimmune conditions or just disease in general. Like when you're diagnosed with something, there is part of you that becomes attached to the name of that diagnosis, and it sort of becomes part of the webbing of like your quilt of life. And I think it can be damaging, even if it's kind of enlightening. So I'm not against chasing a diagnosis, but I am against it if it leads to inaction, which I think it does for a lot of people because they're like, oh, I have this chronic condition, I can't do XYZ anymore, and that further limits themselves. So while I think there is an appropriate discussion around like ableism, like you'll hear that a lot in like the chronic or autoimmune community or chronic health community of like, oh, these ableists telling me I should just like get over it or whatever. I think there's some right stuff with that, but I think there's also the other side of you do hold yourself back with the thoughts that you perceive around your being. And so it's very similar with eating disorders, which I find to be a very touchy subject. Luckily, since I've had one, I feel like I can talk about it and not give give an F about it. Because it's like it was my experience. But I think I definitely have a more aggressive point of view with eating disorders. And mental health in general than maybe most people would. And I think part of that is I'm innately over analytical by nature. And actually, if we go back to sort of the premise of my story, it all kind of began when I moved to Utah when I was 14. My dad sort of got let go randomly. And there was just this whole drama of just my life being uprooted. And it was not my first move. I'm actually from Wisconsin originally, and we moved to central Kansas. And so that was already somewhat of a traumatic event. I was 7 years old when we moved the first time. But the second move wasn't the same because it was just so sudden. Like my dad just got fired. I literally came home from school that day. He was home. My grandparents were visiting at the time. I remember it like vividly, like a dream. I walk in the front door, I see my dad, and I'm like, well, why the hell are you home right now? Like, you're supposed to be at work till 5 or whatever. And my grandpa just comes up and hugs me and says, it'll be okay. And I have zero context around the statement. And my dad comes over and my dad's not an overly emotional person, at least outwardly. He's very emotional. I think on the inside, he doesn't have a very good way of expressing it. But he just tells me that he just straight up says, I got fired today. And I knew in that moment that my life wasn't going to be the same because I was living in a small town, central Kansas at the time, not a lot of job opportunity. My dad worked for a pharmaceutical company at the time, and that was probably that was like the major job draw to this town. So it wasn't like he was going to find another job in this town and life was just going to go on. I kind of knew we were going to move. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, I didn't know where. And so I just remember going outside and my friend was hanging out with us at the time and we just all cried together, just on the pavement, just like teens just crying on the pavement in our driveway because we knew like life was never going to be the same. And we ended up moving to Salt Lake, which I sort of mentioned to you pre-show, ended up, eventually being a good thing. It just took me many years to realize this. But I was sort of in denial of this move, and I was starting high school. I had to make completely new friends. And there was something about this move that I'm still sort of working out, in therapy and doing EMDR and various like things of what it did to me mentally and physically. Because after that moment, I was never the same. I was a very outgoing, happy-go-lucky kid, could talk to anybody, and very easy to make friends with, was making friends all the time. But something changed when I moved to Salt Lake, where I just was not connecting with people the same. I could still talk to anybody, and I had friends that I would call school friends, friends I would have at school, but I didn't make any real genuine connections where like it didn't feel like work to have this social interaction. And so that really distraughted me because I was a very socially dynamic person, and not having that anymore it was a big struggle for me. And that's sort of when I started developing, anxiety. My mom was having to check me out of school like every day for the first like 6 months living here in ninth grade. And I was just sort of faking it till I made it, except I never made it. And these sort of, things just started to compound over time. And that eventually led to me basically feeling out of control. And so if we look at an eating disorder as a fundamental basis of trying to control what you feel out of control of, I got really into fitness and health, and I was playing golf competitively at the time. I was varsity in high school, played for college for a little bit. And so I put all my focus in that, and eventually I just took it way too far. And kind of like overnight, even though it wasn't, I woke up one day and I was 80 pounds and I knew I was in deep shit, and I didn't know how to get out of it. So that's kind of like the really fast version of, 5 years of, setup for my eating
Yeah.
disorder.
Wow. I want to hear you comment on this because our experiences of living in this area have been quite different. So I was raised LDS. I was born in North Dakota, but my parents moved here back home for them when I was like 1.5. So I'm basically not necessarily born, but totally raised in the religion. I served a 2-year mission. And my experience growing up was it wasn't like we couldn't play with other kids that weren't Mormon. It was like you could. But the thing is, like, those are just the kids you hang out with. You go to church on Sunday, which is 3 hours, and all of a sudden it's just your normal friends who are also at church or also at school. So you're naturally like closer to them than you are to the kids who are, maybe live in the neighborhood and you see them at school and maybe they play after school, but they're not there on Sunday. So it naturally selects like this kind of thing where I would just go play with my Mormon friends. They have the same households. We talk about the same things. We go to church on Sundays without really realizing that we're like, purposely or not purposely excluding other people. Now, you've come in at a very traumatic age. I moved within the valley at about that same age. That was traumatic for me, just moving inside the valley, moving in as an outsider into this state, into this area where there's that religious kind of pretense is extremely challenging. And, I'm no longer with the faith anymore, and I can still be a chameleon. I can, have my Mormon clients and I can know what to say and do and how to act. And I can kind of dance around that a little bit. I just want to acknowledge that like moving here for somebody who hasn't been here can be extremely difficult and traumatic, even on itself, regardless of all those other things you listed.
Well, and I came from, I mean, it wasn't quite Bible Belt, but I came from a very small Christian town in central Kansas. So I had very religious friends. I never grew up, uh, really going to church or in any other faith, but I mean, I didn't grow up atheist either. We just didn't go to church just because we moved around so much as kids. We didn't have like ruts anywhere. Um, but I that was part of the shock. And actually, it's funny. We had friends in Kansas growing up that were LDS that I never knew were LDS. We just went to
Interesting.
school with them. We hung out with them. Didn't know they were LDS until we moved here, and we saw them again here. And I was like, "Whoa! I had no idea you were Mormon." But at this time when I moved, I didn't even know what a Mormon was. I didn't know what the LDS Church was, and so I had friends that were. I had a friend whose dad was a Catholic priest, and my friend was warning. He was like, "Oh, watch out for the Mormons," and I was like, "What the hell is a Mormon?" Is what I was thinking. And then I moved there, and so I think it wasn't like I certainly felt excluded, but it wasn't like from straight exclusion via other people. It was just sort of one of those things where like you would talk to someone and I'm just like, I'm not meshing with anything that's going on. And so I mentioned before the show, like my brother having personal experiences where his friends' parents wouldn't let him sleep over or something like that because he was not LDS and they were not sure, what his background was. Was he going to say some crazy crap like, and try and push their ideology or anything, which never happened. But it took them a little bit of time from a parent's side to warm up. Whereas I think his actual friends didn't really care about that
Yeah.
because we're all just kids. But for me, it was sort of a hard time because like, I mean, man, I didn't know what family home evening was. I didn't know
Right.
any of these things. And funny story, which maybe we can get into a little bit, which I think leads to some more of the trauma developing my eating disorders. I dated someone in the LDS faith when I was a senior in high school, and it got pretty hot and heavy. And I actually converted to being LDS. I got baptized and everything without telling my parents. Um, and I didn't really believe in the faith, but I was just like so head over heels, like with this girl. I mean, first love scenarios. Um, and this is all pre-anorexia. And then that just went ass up because you can't really fake it till you make it in the church once they start telling you to like go on a mission or think about going on a mission and all this stuff. And it starts
That's
getting
right.
real. So that fell apart. And it was after that breakup that I actually got into my eating disorder tendencies and started losing all
Wow.
the weight. So, there is a story aspect of that, but sort of what I became when I moved here, and I realized this in retrospect, was I didn't feel like I could be myself in order to get friendship. And so I would sort of, like you mentioned, being a chameleon, I sort of acted how I felt I needed to act to develop friendships, but it wasn't true to myself. And I mean, really, I became a compulsive liar, basically, for up until even 5 years ago, being like crazy amount of lies, like lying about huge aspects of my life because I was so insecure about who I really was and how it affected my relationships. And it always like ended up, backfired on me. And so it created like this vicious cycle then of just like negative self-talk, more lies, developing friendships, those getting ruined by lies, so it was just sort of this huge thing. And a huge part of my healing that I'd struggled with for a long time up until the last, several years was how can the perpetuator of evil heal? Because to me, I was lying to all these people. Like I lied to my girlfriend about being into the faith. I lied to my parents about being into the faith. I lied to the church, like all this stuff. Um, I was the one that did the lying. And I could see how a victim, someone who has been lied to or cheated or hurt, can go through a healing journey. But how could I, as the perpetuator of that evil, come back from that? I had a hard time. That was a big grapple in my thing, being the enemy, being the antagonist.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that was a huge thing. And that's probably multiple podcast episodes deep worth of crap.
Totally. No, it's just an interesting nuance in, the culture around here. And you're right. Like that's my shadow side as well. I will be the chameleon, and it makes it tricky for me to also be authentic at the same time. And usually I'm not as genuine as I could be. And so it's
Mhm.
definitely something to be aware of. So I appreciate that nuance. And I think that's a big part of the story as well. But let's dive into kind of the side where the anorexia was starting to kind of fall off the track a little bit. How did that progress?
Yeah, I mean, so what happened was I got through my first year of college and I was going up at Weber and everything was pretty normal. And my relationship kind of fell apart that summer semester after my first year of college. And I kind of just didn't know what to do with myself because my life was so wrapped up in like her life and kind of doing things she wanted and stuff like that. Um, and so I didn't really know where to put my energy anymore. And so I got really into health and nutrition. I'd always been kind of into exercise and stuff like that. I was just consuming like Athlean X like crazy and all these sort of generic, gym bro people stuff. And in the health community, generally speaking, in the US, more people need to lose weight than probably gain weight. I've always been on sort of the underweight side of the spectrum anyways. But you enter the fitness world and the entire gym community is just like, oh, bulking, cutting, bulking, cutting. And so I don't know where I got it in my mind that I needed to cut before bulking, but I sort of just got into a cut mentality and just did it for at least a number of months. And then it's almost like I blacked out part of my memory through trauma or something, because like it's seemingly like overnight, I went from like already probably underweight, like 125 pounds. I'm about 5'9" and a half, like 120 pounds, 125 pounds to like 80 pounds.
Wow.
And at that point, I'm like, I do know I have a problem because I fucking, can't walk up the stairs without collapsing. I remember jumping off like a 1 foot ledge, like a curb, like not even probably a foot, it's probably like 8 inches. And literally that amount of force, I didn't even have the muscle to hold myself up. I jump off this curb and collapse. And
Goodness.
I'm lucky I probably didn't fracture a bone because I probably have osteopenia at this point. Um, and at that point, I was so obsessed with the right way to do nutrition and the right way to do all these things that I knew I needed to gain weight, but I had to do it in the quote right way. So um, that I think held me back. And I was working with nutritionists, and my parents were like pulling out all the stops. They like hired me a therapist. They hired me like a personal trainer that wouldn't let me work out because I was 80 pounds, but he would just yell at me every week, basically to eat or I'll die. And then had a nutritionist at Weber State. And I just thought I was smarter than all these people, which is a very common personality type amongst eating disorder people. They think they know everything, and they do. They're pretty damn smart. But at the same time, when you're this malnourished, you're like straight delusional. And so this is where, like, when I was having that conversation with Brett, I think this area comes in where it's not just enough, I think, for most people to just eat whatever and gain weight. I think maybe there's a logical draw to where, like, yeah, you need to like gain weight and get to a set point or whatever. But even after I quote weight restored, after about 2 years of being, dramatically underweight, I weight restored finally, um, by myself because I basically fired all the people I was working with. Um, I still had all these problems. And unfortunately, in the conventional health community, you go to your doctor, you look normal weight and everything. They basically tell you don't have an eating disorder anymore. And so I thought I was fine. But what I had now, as opposed to looking mega unwell, was chronic fatigue, um, uh, basically impotence, um, I didn't realize this till years later, but crash testosterone, osteopenia, um, and a host of all these other problems like hypothyroidism, and all this stuff that I was now dealing with post, low weight anorexia, but still dealing with anorexic tendencies and binging, restricting, over exercising. And it wasn't until I actually developed autoimmune symptoms that I even thought about tackling any of these things. I just kind of thought, this is how it was for me now.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's crazy. So were you ever medicated when you were going on this journey?
Oh yeah, I was on uh an SSRI. I can't remember which one it was now, but basically I was put on an SSRI at the time just for anxiety. They just kind of throw that at you. Um, Later on, like when I actually started getting autoimmune symptoms and like neuropathy symptoms, um, I was put on an SSRI again, but because it takes so long to kick in, they gave me a benzodiazepine to take off the edge and basically just like sedate me for about a month, which I was lucky enough to get off of because getting off benzos is really difficult.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I was on an SSRI for probably 2 or 3 years, which I think actually explains some of the, like the impotence issues because those are related. But yeah, I was on that. And then I just remember one day, I think it was like 2018, so a year before I started developing autoimmune stuff, I just quit it because I was like, is this thing even doing anything? And I quit
Mm.
taking it and I felt zero different.
Wow.
So it always made me wonder if like it did anything at all. Um,
Yeah.
so
Interesting.
yeah.
Interesting. Well, okay. You hear some common, stories with when people talk about eating disorders, and one really common one is that the treatment is by and large like an utter failure. Like, I don't know if you ever made it into inpatient or
I
outpatient.
didn't. I
You
didn't.
did
I
not.
think I think there was a time where I would have like scolded my parents for not putting me inpatient post recovery. Now I'm glad they kind of didn't. I've had close family members with similar situations that do go, and the success rates are not very good. I forget what like the exact percentage is, but the truth of the matter is, um, they basically you go in there and they pump you full of food and they don't let you move. Like you go to like some groups from what I hear and you get some therapy, but that's where I think there's this complete even within the conventional space disconnection between mental health and physical health when all of these things are intertwined. And so you can't just treat mental health by just going to therapy. I think if you're not applying a physical modality to that, you're really doing yourself a half truth, which leads to a full lie. So for me, well, I think therapy has been beneficial to me. Um, it doesn't solve all these inappropriate physiological inputs that create poor mental health in the first place. And that goes beyond just trauma.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you mentioned restoring weight. Like, yes, we can restore your weight by doing
Mhm.
exactly what you described, but that's not fixing the issue. That's what everybody tends to tell me is like, yeah, that we
Mhm.
were able to get my weight back. Guess what happened the very first day that I got out of there? I went back
Relapse.
to doing the exact same thing that I was doing before because I'm damn good at it. I'm really good at restricting and knowing
Yeah.
how many calories are in things. Like,
And yeah, and I was talking to so my client I was talking to earlier today, we were talking about how I view disordered eating or anything similar to that, just like any other addiction. It's actually very similar. Like an addiction or having an eating disorder is very similar to alcoholism or being addicted to heroin or something like that. It's you think you're in control of the disorder when the disorder controls you, as opposed to like going and shooting up or going and like buying a bottle of vodka from the liquor store. You just are restricting, or maybe you're bulimic, or maybe you have orthorexia and you're overexerciser, and you're maybe doing all these things together. It's an addiction to for me, it was an addiction to having a problem actually, because I sort of got obsessed with solving my anorexia, but not actually taking action to solve it. So I was obsessed with getting to the root of it, but I was afraid that if I solved it, what would I have to solve? And so I was sort of addicted to being depressed in a sense. And I think that's a very real reality for a lot of people that suffer from mental health conditions is they have a lack of dopamine and various things. It's so much more nuanced than like you could probably get into in one, in an hour show. But it just goes to show that it's like it's all about control and thinking you're in control when you have no control at all.
yep, yep, yeah, well said. I don't think most people consider that, so I really appreciate that.
Mhm.
Let's talk about how you were able to actually heal from this. What were kind of some of the next steps, and what things did you find after firing everybody and feeling like, again, yeah, you can bring your weight back to where it needs to be, but the issues are not fixed. How did you end up sorting that out?
Well, I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't know where I would be today um if I didn't get an autoimmune disease. I would like to say maybe I would have figured out some of the stuff that I know now, but I can't tell you I would have because unfortunately, the way it tends to work in society these days is you have to have a problem that conventional means cannot solve in order to think outside the box. And otherwise, you think it's all fine and dandy. Like I thought our medical system was great until I needed it. You know what I mean? Never needed it growing up, never like got sick, never had any chronic conditions really. Um, you know, only time I missed school was when I pretended to be sick. And so I never needed the medical system. I got my flu shot every year, all sorts of stuff, but I thought it was totally fine. And until I knew it was flawed from my anorexia case, but I thought I had handled it. So it wasn't until I started developing like tingling and burning and numbness and all this stuff that my doctors couldn't explain to me and said it was all in my head that I realized, holy shit, like did I do this to myself through my anorexic behavior? That was actually my initial thought. The minute I realized this wasn't carpal tunnel anymore and it was spreading all over my body, um, I was like, I did this through chronic stress. And I had not researched it at all yet, but I knew that things I had did contribute to this. I ate tuna every day for 4.5 years. Uh, I definitely had mercury issues, which was corroborated through testing later. But my first initial thought was like, shoot, anorexic behaviors and tons of tuna gave me neuropathy, is what I was thinking. And so I started taking actions on those things. But really, what got me out of it was spending 1 year messing around with conventional medicine in 2019 and then COVID happening, which made me have to give up on that because they wouldn't let you travel anywhere because of the COVID concern at the time. And that forced me to look outside the box. I probably would have wasted time in doctor's offices for another 6, 7 months and then quit if COVID hadn't happened. And so the COVID year for me was actually the most enlightening year of my life, where I started, discovering people like Dr. Terry Walls, who overcame MS by understanding mitochondrial principles and reading their books and, getting into functional medicine and making a lot of mistakes there. And it took me a good, 3 years to feel like a normal person again, and applying lots of different principles and learning that once you think you figured it out, you should look in the mirror because there's still something left to learn. And that's kind of the way I approach client work and, my health, even currently, even though it's probably better than it's been in 10 years. I still look at myself as a work in progress. And so I think the number one thing I did to improve was continue to think there's still more to go. And that's not in an obsessive fashion per se of like anally thinking like, oh, I got to minutely, pinprick this blood marker or thing over here. But it's more about just realizing that everybody's an incomplete picture, and that's just the journey of life, and it never ends. Um, like even now, it's like I think there are aspects of me that I could say I'm healed, but I'm still healing. You know what I mean? And maybe that's a lifetime journey, and I'm okay with that. I think the biggest mental stride I made that took a couple years was being okay with not being okay, with being okay with not having figured it out. And I tell every client this that I onboard that it'll be the hardest thing you ever do. And I'm not saying you'll get this in a week or a month of us working together, but you need to be okay with not being okay yet. And that doesn't mean you have to be okay with being sick, but it means you have to accept. It's called radical acceptance. You've heard this. You have to be okay with where you're at, because if you don't accept where the start point is, you'll never get to the end point. You know what I mean? So I think that's probably the biggest lesson. Maybe that's not helpful. Maybe it's like too vague, and maybe we can get a little more specific. But it's one of those things where once you've worked with enough people, any practitioner worth their salt will tell you that everybody is dealing with different things. That's why, like, when people come to me with the same autoimmune neuropathy or Hashimoto's, I tell them straight up, what I did for me may not even be completely applicable to your situation, because I guarantee you, you didn't have the same background as me. I've had a few clients that did have past eating disorders, but many of them don't, never had a problem with that. So you have to like kind of view that differently. And that's why I think a really good health timeline is important for people. So you can actually see what periods of life and those interactions that they had led them to the final domino fall of autoimmune symptoms that they experience now. Because disease doesn't start yesterday when you have symptoms. It's could be years before. Like I said before, I had chronic fatigue for 5 years before I got an autoimmune disease. And you bet your butt that was mitochondrial dysfunction all the way, that I just didn't know what was going on. And no doctor's going to know that. So sometimes you have to go through hell to find the pearly gates or whatever.
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well said. No, I don't know who I'm stealing this from, but I remember hearing like, if you've seen one case of eating disorder, you've seen one case of eating disorder. Just to remind you that like, yeah, there might be some commonalities here, but everybody is going to be so different. And the cool thing about your story that I really appreciate is you use past tense and also currently use lots of different things, lots of modalities, all kinds of different stuff to help you with your healing. And I'm wondering, how did the nutrition piece fit into all of that? And how would you weigh that against some of the other modalities that you've used in the past? Was that like the most important? Was it one of the most important, or was it just one of many, many things that you've used to help get to the point of you're you're mostly healed, but still healing, still ways to go, but like you've recovered to the point that you're able to share this with others now.
Yeah, it's funny. I used to use the analogy of like three legs of a stool. And I think if you talk about mitochondrial like bioenergetics and stuff like that, there are three legs of the stool. It's light, water, magnetism. Um, but as far as like diet goes, um, because for most of my journey, even like, I mean, I was on that one medication. Um, and then during my autoimmune time, minus the 1 month that I was on Klonopin, they prescribed me like an SSRI that I just never ended up taking. Um, but minus that first month that I was on Klonopin, I didn't medicate at all. Um, I was on no prescribed medications. I had things prescribed to me. I just never picked them up. And so, and I kind of knew that that wasn't the route that was going to lead me to success. If anything, it was just going to mess with other inputs. So I've always been sort of, if you can handle it, don't take something unless you're like, I don't, thwart anyone for doing it. I understand their situation, but it does make things trickier because now you're messing with, you know, chemical processes in the brain and all these things that, can, create misinterpretations of what you need to do, or other nutrient deficiencies, for example, if people are on PBIs or whatever. So as far as like the mental side of things, for me, the initial kickstart for me that brought about my recovery was straight up my personal trainer yelling at me every day that I would die. Um, and I think I just needed tough love, and I think that kind of kickstarted my willpower to like go through with just eating 4,000 calories a day and gaining like 40 pounds. And I was using real food, which makes it even harder because real food's freaking satiating. And so one thing I didn't realize I was doing during that time that I realized like when I was talking to Brett and years later was I was probably in ketosis healing without knowing what ketosis was. I was just sort of eating what I thought were like, real foods. And so I wasn't eating grains. I really wasn't eating rice. I was eating like tons of avocado, like high calorically dense fat foods. But I wasn't like, oh, I'm in ketosis, so I'm tracking these biomarkers and things like that. But I do think there was a part of that that led to, because of the high amount of nutrient density in meat and fat and all these things, and the amount of like electron flow and those things, that allowed me to have better mental clarity than maybe I otherwise would have had if I went to sort of, an inpatient center and they were chucking me full of glucose and messing with my neurotransmitters, because, a lot of those neurotransmitters are synthesized in the gut. And so I think actually inadvertently, I was sort of creating a gut healing environment without even knowing what I was doing, if that makes any sense. So I do think from like an initial recovery point of view, that was huge, to be, in a ketogenic paradigm without even knowing what that was. And a lot of those things I learned in retrospect. So I think it can be powerful. The area that it gets tricky, and where I do disagree with other people in the eating disorder space that come from a more conventional plane of view, and even friends that I have, is that they say, well, you're just engaging in another eating disorder. Um, which to me, the standard American diet's the largest eating disorder that we freaking have on the planet. There's nothing conventionally normal about that. Like I made a post like today or something on my Instagram that was just like, isn't it strange that in society, we eat all this junk and then we call real food dieting? You know what I mean? And it goes so much further beyond that. But when you're talking to someone with an eating disorder, and I started out as an eating disorder recovery coach. So that's where my coaching life began, was as an ED coach. Um, you do have to tread lightly when you're bringing up concepts around this, because first you have to find the intention of that person's eating disorder and know what they're doing it with, because there are plenty of people that I think would do the paradigm of eating that I would do, but they're really using it as a form of restriction. And so for me, um I had to go through I went through a period where I was basically binging 10,000 calories a weekend, going to Johnny Rockets and IHOP and all this stuff to prove that I wasn't scared of these foods, to kind of get over that hump. Because I think there's a difference between avoiding food that's not good for you and being afraid of food that's not good for you. Like I'm not afraid of a pint of ice cream. And I've even had, plenty of ice cream, you know what I mean? In the past like 10 years. I mean, you know, obviously I'm not like obese or diabetic or anything right now. But my point is like, um, I think most people have an inappropriate or unhealthy perception around food, which helps them make inappropriate choices. So I think it does start with like choice and what your intention behind your choice is. And so that's where like with an eating disorder and recovery, if they do want to go a more meat based, like there's another great example. Her handles like run, eat, meat, repeat. She's a nutritionist that had an
Show
eating
her.
disorder.
She's
Yeah,
amazing.
Michelle. Yeah, I've talked to her a lot. Um, and I'm sure she would even say that it's like if you're working with someone like that is in the eating disorder mentality, you really have to improve their intention before I think you can have them dive in. But at the same time, it's one of those fine lines where it's like I don't think telling them to eat a whole pizza is necessarily helpful because that advice turned me into a binge eater. And that actually made it worse because I would binge and then spend a week restricting because I just binge ate 5,000 calories, which is just completely, counterintuitive to the process.
Yeah.
So I do think from an eating disorder side of things, it starts with intention and where your heart's really at. But I do think if more centers focused on the importance of like nutrient density and how this affects your mind and the way you make decisions, I think that's an important aspect to it because the way I think eating disorders are perpetuated right now is that it's all just a mental thing. When I think the way you do eat does perpetuate the behavior because you're just not even thinking straight. Like you can't because you don't have the proper neurotransmitters running. So I think that's an important nuance to that story.
I appreciate that. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at things. And before interviewing Carolyn Beckwith, who also appeared on that
Mm,
episode that you did with Dr. Scher, I'd never really considered this. And I heard her talking about it. I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm just curious to hear your opinion. When we take somebody who has eating disorder, they're already have a obsessive kind of like nature to them. So if we set up a framework of you can eat as much of these foods as you want, and like you said, like it's not that you should be afraid of a pizza, but it's just not the same kind of quality of food that's really going to feed your brain.
mhm.
Whatever seems restrictive is actually playing into the hand of the
Yeah.
person who's going to restrict anyway. I had never really considered the benefit of that. Do you agree or disagree with her on that?
I would totally agree with that. Yeah, I think at the end of the day too, it's like people don't. I don't think they really go into a problem, whether it's a mental health problem or a health problem or both. I pose this to every client. I always tell them, "What would you do with health?" And most people don't even have an answer to that straight up when they're in the midst of their problem. But I think a mental exercise that would behoove everybody that's dealing with any sort of issue is to sort of do that visualization of what does life look like post my problem. And that was one of those questions that I never asked myself ever during my journey that I think would have made decision making a little bit more level headed because I think people are just living so day to day in those scenarios that it's like they don't even know what the goal is other than their doctor said, well, you got to gain 30 pounds because you're freaking underweight. And so they're viewing the context of it all wrong, where it's like similar to weight loss, where it's like to me, it's not about um the like if it fits your macros model. It's about creating health instills weight loss. So if you view at it as like you're instilling health, then the rest follows almost automatically. And so that's kind of the way I view almost every condition now, is like it's not about like you gotta do XYZ. It's just about if you create the right inputs of health, the right outputs will just happen. And that's sort of a simpler model for people to follow, I think.
Well said. I like that. You mentioned the three-legged stool, and you can talk about this any way that you want, either like your own recovery or how you work with people today. But can we talk about those three legs of the stool and how you look at those? And again, whether you want to approach it from your own personal life or how you're helping your clients with that. Can you explain like some of the things you think about when you're like explaining that three-legged bar stool?
Yeah, and I think there was a guy that really put it best that we had on our podcast a while ago named Dr. Stephen Hussey, who has more of a cardiologist background. But we were talking about what disease really is. And we were talking about physical disease, but we were talking about how if you look at like a diseased cancer cell, and a disease cell compared to a healthy cell, there's really just a loss of charge in that cell. So really all health is reinstating that proper charge to a cell. And so if you view it from that lens, it seems way more tackleable than like, oh, you got to like, detox from mold and heavy metals and like do all these things and do this protocol. It gets really overwhelming. And so when I'm talking about those three legs of the stool, it really is built on principles by like a lot of people have talked to like Dr. Jack Kruse or Gerald Pollack or Gilbert Ling, who proposed like water battery. And really it's just like going back to nature's laws. That's all it is. It's like everything on this earth requires two major things, light and water. That's like all life, right? And we're like 70-80% water. And it goes into like all the bioenergetics of what those water do. But on an energy first basis, it all goes back to light. Like if we're talking about the electron transport chain, for example, in the mitochondria, I'm trying like to not get like too crazy in the weeds so that people actually understand what I'm talking about. But uh, I'll take it from the lens of like circadian biology, right? So I think a lot of our food problems actually stem from light problems. And there's research corroborating this where you can like, for instance, stimulate insulin via just artificial blue light and keeping someone in a vat for a while, like indoors. I could make someone insulin resistant without any food and just shining bright ass light on them 24/7, makes them insulin resistant. And so it sort of opens this question of like food maybe not being the most fundamental aspect of metabolic health problems, but maybe a secondary or even further down the line effect of these health problems. And so for me, sort of when I approach client work, I always approach it from a light first principle of helping them redesign their circadian biology. So like viewing morning sunlight, trying to get outside as much as possible, viewing evening sunlight, blocking artificial light at night, improving melatonin synthesis and creation within the mitochondria. And so it's not that I don't think food's important. And I talk tons about food with clients. It's just sort of from the perspective of like, for instance, I get a lot of clients that do, ketogenic diets or have done them for a long time or have done carnivore, all this stuff, and they're still dealing with a lot of problems. And that's because there's still other stuff they haven't bothered to address. And so it just goes a lot deeper. I don't think that it's necessarily more, I mean, it is more complicated, but I just usually have people I usually use this example of like, look outside your window and you'll know what to do. Like observe animals in your space. Like they're always grounded. They're always, getting natural light. When they get too much light, they go in the shade. They're not using lights at night. Maybe we weren't designed to, have light on all the freaking time. That's kind of what I mean by those things. They're just principles of nature. But we can dive into some of the nuances if you want, if you have like a crazy specific question with that.
No,
There's
not
just so many
necessarily.
directions we can take.
Right. Yeah. Not necessarily anything crazy specific, but there's so many things that are, in those ranges, like controllable things you can do and you can address. And there's also things that are outside of your control. So I'll give you an example. I am looking outside my window. We have Wi-Fi in our house. We have the 5G
Yeah.
Wi-Fi. It runs during the day. It's how we run our business. We connect with people, even with you across the valley, which is great. And I understand 5G is not the best, and so I have a kill switch on my Wi-Fi that would turn off my Wi-Fi at night. And
Yeah.
I would open up my phone, and that's great. And I'm glad I did that. But I open up my phone, and I'm looking at the roof of like 4 or 5 houses that are within like an easy throw of my, I could throw a rock and hit many of them. They don't have kill switches on
Yeah.
their Wi-Fi's, and there's people behind, like we're in a tight area, and so like I can't control everybody else's Wi-Fi. So I'm like, why am I doing this? Is this the best thing to do when everybody has their Wi-Fi on? So I'm just curious, like if we were to break apart each one of those pillars, what would be some of the most low-hanging, kind of
Yeah.
easy
Yeah.
stuff
Yeah.
that could help?
And I think it's like kind of what you said, like it's easy to like turn it into like an obsessive worrying thing. And like the truth, like I live in the valley, like I got neighbors that definitely don't turn off their Wi-Fi or anything like that. And I'm sure like there's a tower like a mile and a half or two down the road or whatever. There's one on every freaking public school. So should you pull your kid out of public school because there's a 5G tower by the seminary building, and it's one of those things where it's like you really can only do what's in the realm of your control. And frankly, at the end of the day, health's about running experiments on yourself, N of ones, and seeing how you respond. And so I'm not going to tell anyone that feels freaking great that they need to do XYZ because what they're doing is bullshit. because I'm really more of a proof of work person where it's like, if it's working for you, keep going. When I'm dealing with somebody or working with somebody like myself, or a client that has multiple autoimmune conditions, maybe you do have to push it further. I haven't had anyone had to like move out of their residence yet, out of like 150 people, which is pretty good. I would think in a track record. But I will say, like, when it comes to things like non-native EMFs, it's like it's all about proximity. So like for you, you're doing the best you can within the proximity of the greatest amount of EMF output in your residence, which would probably be your router, or like sleeping with your cell phone next to your head. So like usually it's like what you tell people, it's like, I put my phone on airplane mode or turn it off at night, put it by my nightstand, don't got to worry about it. If you're going to leave it on because you're one of those people that's like, oh man, what if grandma dies at 2 a.m. and I get a call or whatever, then put it hella across the room. So that it's sort of it's called the inverse square law, which is basically it's a physics principle that basically states like the further distance from a radiation source you are, the less radiation you are exposed to by like a factor of 4 or something like that, or a quarter. And so for me, it's like, if you're on your laptop, don't put the laptop on your lap. If you're like me, just sitting 2 feet away from it is dramatically lower than me touching it or having my face on it. Or for instance, you have these 2-prong cables that come with your computer or your cell phone. When you plug this in and then you plug your laptop or phone into it, that dramatically increases the output of EMF from your device, because now you're plugging the AC grid into your laptop. So try not to use your laptop when it's plugged in charging, or your phone. Can't always get away with that. So, you let it go or whatever. Or if you can in the summer, you'll find me, we would be doing this call outside my backyard.
Hell
I'd
yeah.
be grounded, and then I'd be offsetting some of that EMF by just simply uptaking free electrons from the earth. So
Hell
for
yeah.
me, I think I can give you like a bunch of easy things that anyone can do almost for free right now. One of them would be like, installing a kill switch, or like an outlet timer on your Wi-Fi, turn it off at 10 p.m. at night, have it turn back on at 6 or 7 or whatever. Um, and it's also great for like power saving in some instances. But like, for instance, another thing is like when I'm at home, I never use my phone on LTE unless it's completely necessary. If I'm going to use it, I have my phone on airplane mode. I'll see if I can show you, and I'll turn on the Wi-Fi. Oh, it's because my thing's blurred. Anyway, I have Wi-Fi on, and I'll use that because I can do almost every function on my phone from using Wi-Fi, and then I'm not having it connect to Wi-Fi and my 5G tower down the street and have Bluetooth on, even though I'm not using it. Like, a lot of people just have all these settings on for no reason. Like, you're not using Bluetooth right now. Why do you have it on? Only turn it on when you need it, and that'll help the amount of output from that phone, or your cell phone or your laptop or device. Other thing you can do, which is, if I had one principle that I would tell everyone to do, is like, get light first thing in the morning outside. Open your window, like stand outside on the porch for 5 minutes. Like, that light that enters like your hypothalamus in the morning is like the most important thing you can do. It sets up the entire day, every hormonal cascade. If you're worried about cortisol, I see these things on TikTok all the time about cortisol face and you need to take this supplement to lower cortisol. Fuck that shit. Go outside and see the goddamn sun in the morning, and that sets your fucking rhythm. Like, sorry to swear, but like that's like bigger than any supplement you're gonna waste like 20 quid on or whatever, throughout the day. And so those are probably the biggest things. The other thing is, like, you see kind of this red bulb I have above me. You don't have to use this. You could light candles at night, but this is like a red light bulb, much more pleasant for melatonin, suppression than turning on these bright lights. Dim the lights at night. If we're watching Netflix at night, we dim the TV all the way down. I'm wearing blue blockers. I'm wearing long sleeves or whatever to like get it off my skin. Very practical things that I think people could do. And I think people don't realize, like, you don't even have to spend all that much money to like mitigate a lot of these major problems. And it's like, if you live in an apartment, like, yeah, you can't control your neighbor's Wi-Fi, but you are controlling the fact that you're not sitting next to your own Wi-Fi box that's going to be radiating you way more than your neighbor's Wi-Fi across the building. So
Yeah.
it's one of those things. It's like, my brother used to sleep in the bedroom with the Wi-Fi box. Like, why the hell would you do that? Like, even if you're not going to turn it off at night, put it as far away from your bedroom as possible. Like,
Yep.
very simple reconstituting your rooms can do huge things. Now, if you do work with someone that has a lot of problems and maybe they're doing these things and they're still dealing with some symptoms, that's when you do have to have that conversation. How far are you willing to go to feel as good as you can feel? Are you
Great point.
willing to move? Some people are going to have to do it. If you live in a house with mold and you can't afford to remediate it, got to get your ass out of there. Um, it just, there are simple things that I cannot change about how nature works. Like you can get an air filter like I have in my room for $100. You can open the windows to let that aerate your room, and that will help while you're still figuring out those other larger problems. You can try to control the humidity in your home, which also helps. But sometimes you gotta, do the hard shit and move your ass somewhere
Yeah.
else. And so like I have had clients that are inner city, and I think we've lucked out with just like being really hardcore with some of these other principles around like light and food and really managing the problem. But if they wanted to be a little more flexible with their diet or whatever that is managing the symptoms, they probably couldn't live in a high-rise downtown LA. So it's the trade-off. We're always trading convenience for time. And so you got to decide what level of each you're willing to accept in your situation. And I have no hard feelings about how far you're willing to go. I just know that for me, feeling good isn't worth more than everything else. So like if I had to give up like living in the valley and had to move to like, somewhere down south further or whatever, I would try to figure out everywhere I could to do that to feel better. So that's kind of my mentality around it. I think those
Love
are
it.
probably simple things. I mean, and like food's such an individual story too. I have people that it's like, um, not that I don't think ketosis isn't beneficial for everyone at some point, but I kind of look at food as in a more seasonal sense of winter's the time of survival and strife. And so it makes sense if you live in the Northern Hemisphere to be ketogenic in the winter. And so I kind of approach my diet in a more seasonal sense where it's like more meat and fat in the winter. And then as things come into season, I kind of like throw in whatever's seasonally growing. And that's kind of my diet now. I'm not in like perpetual ketosis, but there are scenarios where it's like if you're in a high EMF environment, maybe you live in a high rise downtown LA, or downtown New York City, and you have 10 autoimmune diseases, maybe being long-term ketosis is actually beneficial for you just because of the amount of ROS that you're dealing with. So it's all context dependent. I think the thing that people lose, and maybe the last message I'll sort of give here is like, you need to remove all the noise and think about what is my environment like and how do I need to deal with it? Not Ryan Brown over here who lives across the world from me because his environment's totally different than mine. So you kind of got to view it and like take little bits and pieces of what people do and then apply that to your life. And that's where I think the true value of like working with someone that's good at doing that comes in, is they can help you sort of figure that out with you so that you're not pulling in, strings and just hoping something sticks, basically.
Wow. Man, that was so well explained. I love the answer. I think that's wonderful advice. And yeah, I think your blue blocker glasses are a wonderful example of this is a very low cost thing that if you really don't want to turn off Netflix at a certain time, if you enjoy that storytelling at the end of the day, that's something you can do. There are steps you can take, like you said, and start with the low hanging fruit. And if you need more, you can keep going. Like you said, like your journey is not done. My journey is not done. You continue to improve. And if you find something that makes your life better, great. If not, then you can throw it away and try something different. So this has been an awesome conversation, man. I'm so glad I got to meet you and gotten to chat with you. I've learned a lot. I know our audience was learning a lot as well. Yeah, your story's very inspiring, and it's cool to see how all the pieces came together. And I think the best part is now you getting to do what you're passionate about, what helped you, you're now able to help other people with, which I think is, again, super inspiring. So thank you so much for appearing on our show. Really appreciate your time. Where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, anyone can find me on pretty much any social at Ryan Mitchel Brown. And the one caveat with that is Mitchell is spelled for me with one L at the end, not two, like the standard spelling. My parents don't know how to spell apparently. But it also helps because I think it's very easy to find me. If you just put in Ryan Mitchell Brown with like the one L on Google, I'm pretty much the only one that'll ever pop up. But if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. I'm really good with getting back to people in DMs, and all that stuff.
Dude, so funny. But we were offline and I was telling you, like, it was hard to find information about you and like the podcast that you host, which I
Mhm.
want you to also mention as
Oh
well.
yeah.
That's why I couldn't find all your stuff, dude. I was spelling Mitchell with two L's. No wonder I couldn't find you anywhere. That makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah, yeah. So our podcast is decentralized radio. You can find that on Spotify or YouTube. But yeah, it's like Ryan, I had to emphasize that because I see that even in like even like in like affiliates that I work with, like they'll spell my name wrong in like an invoice. And I'm like, yeah, you gotta like fix that because it's yeah, so it's Mitchell with one L.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, maybe don't hit the L so hard when you're saying it's Mitchell. Just be really
Yeah,
soft. Just the
yeah.
one L.
That's
Yeah,
what it is.
awesome, man. Dude, I love it. This has been an awesome conversation. Like I said, I'm really grateful to know you. Hopefully, we can meet up in person one
Yeah.
day and get a barefoot walk out in the woods or whatever.
Heck yeah.
But for now, again, thank you so very much for coming on our show today. We really appreciate you.
Anytime.
Absolutely. This has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.